So everybody's gradually joining. I think you can see Felipe is there. I'm not
Yep.
sure if you
Hello.
remember Felipe from last
I,
year. Felipe is one of the faculty,
hello.
um,
How are you?
and Sebastian as well from Hawaii.
G'day.
And then Felipe is from Scuba University. He has a lovely kind of logo floating around there. I don't know how he does it, but it's pretty cool. I think I think I saw Professor Ota. Oh, mm, Professor Ota was there too.
Yeah, he's there.
Okay, not from Waseda. Unfortunately,
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry, I'm late. Uh,
okay, so we have almost a lineup of all faculty members except Samoa because they're having the Commonwealth meeting something this week, and I think King Charles is there.
Oh,
So they have to turn the internet off.
are you
No,
serious?
no. He said something along the lines of his university is hosting some meetings and so on. And so, yeah, they won't be able to use the internet. So kind of, they don't have really like broadband or amazing connectivity in Samoa. So maybe there's some limitation there.
Wow.
I'm
Goodness
not sure.
me.
So look, quite a lot of students are joining online, but also in classrooms. So if I switch my camera here, can you see them? I
Oh,
guys can
yes.
give
Hello.
to Laura. And Sebastian, the student, your student. Oh, there's actually Professor Zhang has joined us also from
Hi,
Shanghai.
yeah.
Yeah, we're,
Yeah.
we're all virtual today.
Sebastian, you're what? Sorry?
We're all virtual today.
All virtual. Okay.
So
Brilliant.
everyone's joining individually.
Okay, great. So this since after COVID, we've kind of mixed things up a little bit. So sometimes it's classroom to classroom connection,
Mhm.
and then sometimes it's individual connection as well. So you can see actually quite a lot of students are joining individually.
Mhm.
And then also we ask students to normally put their university affiliation afterwards as well. So you can see the sort of spread of students there. I can see Hawaii students have got their names up, and some students from Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and also we have virtual students who are part of our virtual exchange program as well. So, for instance, a couple of universities from a couple of students from Hong Kong also joining us. So it's a pretty diverse group. And we're really looking forward to your talk. I think is this the third time you've spoken to us or the fourth?
I think this is the fourth, actually.
Uh,
Yeah.
so actually, Lauren is based at La Trobe University in Australia. We spent some time together at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, and we were in the urban sustainability and urban planning group. But I came back here, and then Lauren took over the role of director of the Climate Change Adaptation Lab.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that lab?
Yeah, sure. So I actually, yeah, I've created it at La Trobe, and we are a social science lab. So sadly, when we recently had a government visitor come to visit the lab is my computer, so we had to rush around doing hilarious things, trying to have somewhere to have them. But and it's a group, we've got probably about 12 staff now, and about 7 students, PhDs, and we're very focused on the question of the work of climate change adaptation and how climate change is affecting different types of work. So work is a really broad concept that we use. So it involves not just paid work and professionalization of adaptation, but also, sometimes unpaid work, informal work, the work that allows us to get to work, like, all the background domestic work. So, yeah, it's a really productive kind of, I guess, starting point, and we're busy looking into different sort of sectors at the moment, doing a lot of research.
Sounds fascinating. And in the past, I don't know if the students are familiar, but the top scientific body doing research on climate change is called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And Lauren, you were lead author on the Australasia chapter, is that right?
Yeah. So yeah, for Australia, New Zealand, and I'm just in the thick of finalising the first national climate risk assessment for Australia. So we're a bit behind. We haven't had one before, but we're putting one together, which is a bit of a challenging process, but very productive.
Fantastic. So right in the heart of climate science. And today you're going to talk to us about the bushfires, wildfires.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, have you had the opportunity to update a little bit or? Okay. So I don't know if the students are familiar with the situation in Australia, but every now and again you have a pretty major bushfire that causes a lot of damage. And the concern is that these are going to get worse with climate change. So Lauren, if you want to share your slides, we'll be very happy to listen to the presentation.
All right, how's that?
Perfect.
Good. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming here today and the opportunity to talk to you about a huge event that's happened in Australia in 2019, 2020, from which the impacts are still being felt, but I think there's lessons for a lot of the kind of climate change adaptation work that we all need to do. And I'm very conscious that wildfires are something that many of you will be closely familiar with in your context too, thinking particularly of Hawaii here as well. So I just wanted to, I guess, introduce the fires as something to think with. I don't want to overemphasize them as, something that's so exceptional that is oh, I don't know, I'm jumping. But to kind of, I guess, give you enough of a sense of it as to why it's been so stimulating in the Australian context to sort of have this sense that we're looking into the future, if you like. I'll go through the sort of risks, impacts, and consequences and talk then about this question of how do we adapt to these things. So the context for understanding fires here is twofold. So on the one hand, as Brendan indicated, wildfires have been part of the Australian context forever. We have a very flammable continent. A lot of the species, in particular the dominant tree species, eucalyptus, are made to reproduce with fire. They encourage fire by having a lot of oil in their leaves. So we have flammable vegetation in lots of parts of the continent, not all. And so there's a sort of sense that, there's a little bit of a sort of shrug response when we have these sorts of events. But what's happening is that, as we know, with global climate change, every single element of the climate is changing, every single element of the planet is changing. And what that means here is that we need to think differently about fires. And so it's taking existing issues like fires and revealing them and twisting them in new ways. But overall, it's really challenging us to think differently about things like our relationship to fires, our relationship to the environment. So the particular fires I'm talking about have been labelled the Black Summer because it went for so long. So we're not talking about a fire, we're talking about a whole season of fires, 11 months, so almost a whole year of incredible devastating fires across the continent, covering almost 20% of the continent. And if you know, Australia is very, very big. So it's a very large area, and meant that the response capacity was very, very stretched. People became very tired in a lot of cases. An emergency response capacity just wasn't there. And the other thing about it is that these were not normal fires. The intensity of them was unprecedented. And that's not just a rhetorical use of the word here, but very much a technical sense. The fires, were worse than anything that the models, the climate models had predicted, worse than anything the fire models had predicted. And so it took everyone completely by surprise. And that was part of the impact of them, was simply the shock that this was happening. And so, understanding this, understanding that fires could be so bad that, as you might be able to see in the bottom left, they actually created their own storms. They created their own weather systems that then flew through sparks 30 kilometres ahead. So the fire crews that were trying to respond could never keep up. The fire was rolling through the landscape. It went up kilometres and kilometres and went forward kilometres and kilometres, and was going, at a sort of jet speed. So what I want to do now is talk about what this actually meant. What does this actually look like, and use some kind of basic concepts around climate change. Sorry, I'm not moving the slides. They're kind of possessed here. Talk about what this looks like through a sort of climate change theory kind of lens. Okay, so understanding the flow from climatic change through to climatic impacts, through to the consequences, is really, really important for understanding what then can we do. So we have hazards. So fires are considered to be a hazard. They have a lot of far-reaching flow-on effects. So that box, the first box there, is in of itself very, very complicated. But then the impacts are when they actually intersect with different circumstances. So the impacts for you, the impacts for me, the impacts for another group, impacts for other species, these are all dependent on our situation, our circumstances. Depends how spatially exposed we are, depends how exposed you are over time. And I mentioned this was really long fire season. And it depends particularly on this word vulnerability, which here is a technical term, which refers to all of the other pressures that you're already dealing with. We already know this from our own health. For example, if you catch a cold, how badly you're affected depends on how well you are at that point in time. And other things like, can you rest? Or have you got pressures that mean you can't rest? Or do you have access to medication? Do you not? All of these things make it more complicated. And then the consequences, so you're impacted in, that's the sort of disaster period, if you like. And then the consequences determined by how well you can respond, which is a question of how resilient you and the systems that you're part of, the systems that you're reliant on are, how well they can respond, how quickly they can respond, and the much longer concept of recovery. And that determines overall the long-term consequences. Okay, so what I've described here is a kind of, I guess, a process-based way of understanding this diagram here, just focusing on it's called the sort of propeller diagram, the blades there, which is the IPCC. So this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the kind of conceptual model of climate change risk and impacts, which is that risk emerges out of the intersection of a hazard, the degree of spatial temporal exposure, so the degree to which you're in the path of these hazards. We know that they're unevenly distributed around the globe, and what it means for you or a system or something else because of your vulnerability at that point in time. And I should say that, the flip side of vulnerability is adaptive capacity. So what, how well can you respond? There's a whole lot of social drivers that determine these things. So, for example, in hazards, questions around how you manage vegetation. Are there human sources of ignition? So it might be from machinery, cigarettes, these sorts of things. That determines very much the fire hazard. This exposure question is about where we've placed settlements, where we've put infrastructure, where people happen to be traveling at a point in time. So all sorts of spatial questions, evacuation questions. And the vulnerability one is that big, basically human development piece. It's, well, how well placed are people? What sort of, they often talk about capitals in a kind of metaphorical sense. What skills and knowledge and resources do you have? What relationships do you have to draw on? Are you somewhere where there is an emergency services response or not? Are you isolated? What sort of experience do you have? So these sorts of things. So let's focus first on this hazards question. So fires are very, very interesting because, unlike some of the other climate change kind of hazards that are commonly discussed, in particular sort of purely atmospheric ones like storms, for example, cyclones, hurricanes, tornadoes, all those ones. What we're talking about with fire is very much a relationship between some atmospheric conditions. So they're talking here about weather, so fire weather, and in particular, high temperature and high winds. And then it's how that intersects with other biophysical processes. So how it intersects with the degree of fuel. So if you have fire weather and no fuel, you're not going to get a fire. But if there's something that can burn, and one of the things about these intense fires is that basically everything burns. Cars burn, houses burn, everything burns. And then topography, which is to say the ways in which the landscape is slanted up or down. And we know that when you have a really high slant, a high degree of slope, then fires travel very, very quickly and they tend to accelerate and become more intense. So that's the sort of on the right-hand side, that's the fire behaviour. But whether or not the fire starts is actually an intersection between the fuel question, whether you have heat, so that's links back to fire weather, and of course the oxygen. And so what we had in the Black Summer fires is we had a huge, huge number, thousands of lightning strikes. So although we do have a problem with arson in Australia, so people deliberately lighting fires, because it's a kind of, it's almost like a mental illness, it's criminalized mental illness. We also have these natural sources, lightning. And then the heat was such that some things were simply combusting themselves, in particular, stacks of hay. So this is in summer where people have put hay aside to feed stock. That was combusting. Coal in open cut coal mines, it was combusting. A whole lot of things just combust when it gets hot enough. So anyway, that kind of gives you a sense of kind of the combination or the perfect storm, if you like. That meant that we actually have, a lot of conditions for fire. And as I indicated, we had all these things in the Australian 2019-2020 fire season. And they actually had created, because of the previously worst fires we had, which were in 2009, they actually had to create a new category for the fire weather danger rating. So it used to go up to extreme, the red, and then they had to introduce this new striped one. You can see up there in the top corner, which is catastrophic. And catastrophic fire danger just means that everybody just sits there, holding their breath. It's in really, really frightening conditions. I mentioned the fuel is part of the equation, and I indicated that in the Australian context, we have a flammable vegetation. Not always. We've got also lots of very fire-sensitive areas with rainforest. But we also have a lot of flammable vegetation, and that hasn't just sort of come about by chance. It's also reflects 60,000 years of landscape management by our traditional owners, all of the Australian Indigenous groups, hundreds of which around Australia, have been managing the landscape in a way to cultivate food species. And that's called cultural burning. And one of the things that's happened since colonisation 200 or so years ago is that fire has been, that we've shifted the notion of fire in our, or I should phrase this better, Europeans came with a different conception of fire, where fire was a danger and something to be suppressed at all times. And I believe that's also the case in a lot of other Western countries as well. And so what that meant was that combined with, of course, incredibly violent colonisation processes, traditional owners who were dispossessed from their land were also not able to do cultural burning. And so what that meant is that we've had this massive, massive buildup of fuel, and we now have thicker forests than we used to. It used to be more open woodland. And so that's made the continent more flammable. So it's kind of a complete own goal, if you like, in terms of trying to suppress fires, but then, over the long term, actually making things far more dangerous. And so you can see here in this evocative quote about this sense of uncared for country being a time bomb exploding into firestorms. And it certainly felt like that. There was that real sense that these fires were like an explosion. Okay, so let's then talk about the question of exposure. So who was in the pathway? Well, so sadly, these fires were incredibly destructive. They were fatal. So 34 died, including 2 American firefighters in a helicopter that crashed while trying to dump water on some of the more remote fires. And then, as I'll get to, the smoke itself was the bigger killer and extended across a far greater area of the continent. So 20% was burnt, so that's the flame footprint, but the actual footprint of the fires was far, far more extensive. And so I live in the capital city in Melbourne, and there the smoke haze was thick. People had to wear masks for weeks on end. And of course, our ways of measuring impacts are very, very coarse. They miss most things. And so the kind of number of human injuries and other harms, of course, is not captured in these numbers. And it would extend to, tens of thousands, if not more. At the same time, we're good at counting buildings. So we know that more than 3,500 homes were destroyed, including entire towns just razed. We know how many million hectares were burnt, as I said, an incredible number. And for the first time, there was a focus on animals because the animal deaths in these forests were so extensive, and the estimates of over 1 billion. The response triggered incredible international assistance. So 12 other countries sent fire crews, which I think is just a real testament to, positive international relationships, but also just another indication of way that impacts extend across borders. These things are becoming international now. And partly that's because of the different equipment, but also just, I think, a huge degree of empathy as we all experience these things. And understand just how desperate people are for assistance. And there was a huge outpouring of public funds as well, some of which was controversial because our Deputy Prime Minister at the time suggested people should donate, and people suggested back that maybe the government should actually do something. But anyway, there was a big kind of outpouring of public assistance. So what we're talking about in the first instance is the flames and the heat. So the heat can kill you from 100 meters away, like it's so intense, and the smoke. And so, these are these are the direct impacts. But it's of course not just the sort of quantitative, as I indicated. It's a whole lot of other things, and a lot of people who are involved, have taken a very, very long time to kind of recover from these experiences. And you can see there the sort of this is a volunteer firefighter. You can see there the sort of impacts on biodiversity. I'll talk about koalas in a minute. But as I indicated, trying to understand the costs and losses of this is really, really hard, but it's also really important. So this is really dark stuff, and I apologize for kind of, I guess, dwelling on it, but just if we don't properly capture the costs and losses, we don't really understand what we're dealing with. We don't do the sort of recovery we need, and we're not stimulated to do that degree of adaptation, which is to say, reduce the future risks of this happening again adequately enough. Because as I said, in the Australian context at least, our traditional approach to this has been, she'll be right, mate. We've done this for ages. We'll send out the crews, bit of heroics, and then it's all over kind of stuff. So one of the issues here is, as I said, we tend to count things and then sort of present that as the loss. So 18.6 million hectares burnt, full stop. That's the loss. But what does that mean? What does that mean to lose that much forest? And sorry, that wasn't all forest. So 1.2 million hectares of that was forest is just in the Victorian state. So this is we're down the bottom of Australia, not quite the very bottom, but near. So what does that mean? Well, when vegetation is lost, you then have really bare soil, and the fires ended with some really dramatic rainfall events and wind, which then meant that we lost nearly 1 million tonnes of soil. Excuse me. Then what does that mean? Where does the soil go? We lost the soil. Where does it go? Well, a lot of this was then carried into waterways. What does a huge dump load of soil do into waterways? And it's not just soil, it's ash, it's branches, it's dead animals. It really, really wrecks your water quality, really wrecks your water quality. And there were some major apoxic events as well, algal blooms. And so this then has these further effects on biodiversity, human health, these sorts of things. At the same time, what happened to the material that's burnt? Well, we know it eviscerates into smoke. And part of that is carbon dioxide. So you get this massive feedback loop on climate change as well. So the point is simply to say that we need to get better at tracing the consequences, tracing these impacts, so that we can start to really understand, as I said, kind of what's at stake. As I indicated, the footprint of the smoke was far, far greater than the fire itself. And it actually was international. So it extended across to New Zealand, where there is evidence of it landing on glaciers there. And of course, black soot landing on white glaciers is a terrible thing, partly because it accelerates their melting as well. So one of those sort of feedbacks. As I said, the air itself became very toxic, and it became this hugely disruptive event in and of itself. And it's triggered sort of a whole lot of responses about trying to monitor and give smoke warnings on top of the fire warning. So we had sort of multiple levels of warnings going on. Just to give you a little bit of a sort of insight into what this kind of meant for people. So we, when I was at RMIT, we did a survey of about 1,200 people across different types of work, trying to understand how climate change is starting to affect them. And it covered all sorts of people you could see there, from sort of professionals and managers and clerical workers, community workers, labourers, machinery drivers, etc. And there's a quote here from an older sales worker who talked about the smoke. So when asked to sort of specify what, one of the standout impacts, he really talked about the smoke, particularly because it was combined, as he indicates, with extreme heat as well. He said it was like the planet Venus. And then his vulnerability in this case was an employer, a work context that was unsympathetic and frankly unsafe and probably illegal. So not giving them the masks that they needed despite asking, so finding it difficult to breathe and being forced to work in those conditions. So it just gives you an indication of, for him, the impact of smoke was determined by his need to work in these conditions, and then the attitude of his manager. So the sort of complexities that vulnerability involves. Let's think about schools. We've done quite a bit on schools. We've been doing work more recently on the effect of floods on schools and school children. But just to simply point out the obvious, that a huge number of schools had to be closed, and it was an incredibly frightening situation. And sadly, many schools were actually lost as well in some of the badly affected communities. And this article I put here talks about the struggle for teachers, particularly in rural communities where they're dealing with it personally in their family lives, and then they're going to work, dealing with it in the school environment, and having to be the strong one who actually really calms children down and helps them to process it. And the teachers were then talking about what a kind of huge impact that had on themselves. And then this piece also talks about the way the researchers themselves were impacted also by the same environment and researching it. So the point is, none of us are outside of this. And this is something that a colleague and I, James Watson, discussed in a paper we wrote about how it affects research and universities more broadly. Just to give you an indication, and sometimes people go, oh, you're so selfish, why are you just focused on your effects on yourself? And it's not that, that's not what we're trying to do at all. What we're trying to simply say is that we're not sitting outside of this looking in. The research sector, the university sector, is part of this, and we need to recognise that. So, for example, we documented how PhD students lost their entire projects, how huge amounts of scientific equipment were impacted, about colleagues lost their homes, families in our vicinity were affected, etc. And so it's just the point of really understanding that we're all part of this, and these images are not just from the fires, but from other events, particularly flood events, hail events, that have destroyed huge amounts of university infrastructure over the last few years. Other infrastructure is also one of the ways in which impacts are propagated through society. So when the things that we rely on are affected, then of course that feeds back to ourselves as well. And this is a really, really active area of research in the climate change field as well. And so the classic one, and one that's just been reinforced in Australia just in the last few days, where you've got a large town called Broken Hill, basically without electricity following a storm, is our reliance on electricity. So just think for the moment how well this lecture would go without electricity, not to mention internet communications technologies. Like it enables so much of our society. We've created such electrified, globalized societies. Everything relies on electricity. We did an analysis recently in Queensland that pretty much underpinned that everything relies on electricity, though also we found that, from a kind of more fundamental survival perspective, it's actually the water sector that actually is the priority, because, if you start to get really basic about it, it is actually possible to live without electricity, but it's not possible to live without drinkable water. So we looked at all of this. So back in terms of the fires, one of the big effects was the effects on this sort of infrastructure, and in particular what happened was in the immediate disaster context, and in particular trying to escape from that the kind of most immediate threat, which is the flames themselves, there was huge blockages in the evacuation routes on the highways there, as you can see there. And one of the reasons for the blockages was that cars were running out of fuel. The reasons they were running out of fuel was because the petrol stations or gas stations, they had gas, they had petrol, but they couldn't dispense it because electricity is needed to run the pump to get it out of the ground and into the car. And also the internet was down, so people couldn't use, we call it EFTPOS, but the kind of electronic paying. And so the cars then started running out of fuel, blocking the highway, etc. So it's the interconnection of these sorts of infrastructure that we really need to get our heads around. And so as one of my postdocs at the time, talked about, this was an enormous kind of shock to Australian society. Like, I think everyone sort of had elements of this, but this was across, you've got to understand, this was, across a fifth of the country, like, plus much larger areas as well affected. Like, it really felt like everything was in collapse mode. Okay, so that's the kind of, the kind of acute disaster response phase. But what about longer term? Generally speaking, in terms of research, in terms of media, people move on and stop thinking about these things, but the effects are still emerging. And so in the Australian context, I'm just finishing writing up a big study about a place called the Northern Rivers in New South Wales, where the effects of the fire are acute. It was hugely affected, but since then, they've had 2 major floods and another fire. So the attribution of the kind of, how do you understand what causes what, I suppose? But the fact is we need to keep trying to understand these longer term things, because that's kind of what we're really talking about as these things kind of intersect. And so, for example, school children, it shows up in their school results. So the children affected by the fires badly, it shows up with decreased school performance. Other ways in which the longer term processes show up is when the recovery period is delayed and disrupted. And a key driver of that is problems with housing. We know that from a sort of fundamental basic needs, safe housing is one of the kind of basic things everybody needs. We've already got a shortage of housing in Australia. And what's happened is that after these fires, as well as subsequent events, the pace at which people are able to get back into safe housing has slowed. And so some people are still in precarious housing, living in caravans, sheds, 2 years after these fires. And there's a range of intersecting reasons here. Some of it is to do with insurance problems. So whether it's the insurance companies or whether it's to do with people not having insurance in the first place and then being financially unable to secure somewhere to live. Or we've also had shortages of workers able to build homes and shortage of materials. So that's been, the people we've interviewed talk about this as kind of almost like a second disaster. At the same time, we also know, as I indicated, that when a disaster recovery period is extended, it then starts to intersect with the next event that happens. And so this image here, this is the state of Victoria. The overlapping coloured circles here indicate the number of disasters just within a 3-year period. And so you can see that northeast Victoria, northwest Victoria, these different areas have all had these multiple events to deal with. And so that then compounds. We talked about cascading of impacts through infrastructure, but then this is also a compounding in the one place as you experience one thing after another, and you can't catch your breath, so to speak. Now, as I indicated at the start, one of the questions around vulnerability is to really understand the different circumstances that we all have. Now, those circumstances can vary on a kind of minute-to-minute basis. We all know that. But at the same time, there are also these structural patterns in society, which means that different people are positioned differently and have different capacities, different advantages, but also different disadvantages. And we all know how unequal and unjust many aspects of society are, and that's certainly the case, I'm sad to say, in Australia. So questions that kind of help to understand the sorts of different levels of kind of advantage or disadvantage different populations have, things about whether or not you can access emergency services. So outside of the big cities in Australia, emergency services are pretty much run by volunteers. And in a lot of rural areas, those volunteers are getting older. They're not, those fire services are not attracting younger participants for many good reasons, but also some cultural reasons. And there's just a level of exhaustion. And so, for example, a lot of the people who volunteered, and remember how long these fires went for, they were not being paid and they were on leave from their jobs. So in some cases, some people lost those paid jobs, because they were away for so long. So you've got all these sorts of real complexities which determine whether or not, and so this then determines whether or not you are able to call up and have someone come and help. And in a lot of cases, people were shocked to find that their immediate kind of rescue plan didn't work. People didn't come, they couldn't come. Then there's a question of sort of priorities. So in the face of all of these competing calls and everything, what gets prioritized, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then, as I said before, this question of sort of where the resources go, whose house is rebuilt, these sorts of things. And there's all sorts of controversy and kind of policy questions around that. I just want to talk about koalas for a minute, partly because, they're koalas, we have to talk about them, but also because they illustrate this point I was making about prioritization. So the first thing to know about koalas is that while they are obviously a native animal in eucalyptus forests, and so they've evolved to live in those situations, they're actually themselves hugely vulnerable to fire. So they've evolved to survive fires because the fires that they've evolved with are more those of traditional Indigenous owners, which are small and cool, generally don't get to the crown where the koalas sit, and also are very patchy. So they always leave the majority of the forest unburnt at one time. These, of course, were completely different. They were mostly crown fires, they were intense, and they were of such a scale the koalas couldn't escape. They obviously are not highly mobile. I don't know if you've seen a koala, but they're not highly mobile animals. But the sort of most important point here is that our emergency responses, so as I said, they're very stretched, but they still did have, a major influence on people's outcomes. They have a very human-centric, it's called triage kind of approach. So the first priority is to protect human lives, and it's, obviously we're not going to argue with that. The second one is to protect human property, assets, sheds, any human structure. And the third one is livestock, because that's a human kind of form of capital. And wildlife really haven't featured. There's been a sort of sense that, Australian wildlife are kind of, built to kind of survive. But what happened was that the destruction and the impact on koalas was so great that it's really triggered a lot of conversation about how to shift our prioritization, and in the more immediate sense, it triggered an enormous outpouring and huge amounts of volunteer work into wildlife recovery and relief. There we go. So what I want to sort of, illustrate here is that when we start to put this in the climate change context, we have to understand that we always need to think about what's next. And so the impacts that I've described are not the end of the story. They're actually the start of the story. They're the start of the story that the Northern Rivers has experienced, that other parts of Victoria have experienced, Or, you know, in any disaster context, it's always like, well, now this is how we're placed at this time as we face the next things. And so the impacts have feedbacks. They can actually worsen climatic hazards. I mentioned, for example, might not be the same hazard, but I mentioned how the loss of vegetation increases the risk of erosion and flooding, and that's very much the case. It obviously increases exposure, particularly if you've lost your house, and it increases more than anything your vulnerabilities. And so because of the feedback loop, this is why adapting to climate change is such an urgent thing, because we have to get ahead. And every time the impacts occur, it's pushing us backwards when we need to be jumping forwards at a great rate. So let me talk now about adaptation. So we looked at this kind of process model before, and what it does is it points straight away to places in the system that you can intervene. So you can intervene to reduce exposure. You can try to intervene to reduce vulnerabilities. And then once impacts have occurred, you can do things to try to increase resilience, so how quickly and how fully people are able to recover. And you need to be doing this to the long-term threats as well as near-term threats. So what sort of adaptations are we talking about here? Well, so in the first category, you know, one of the obvious things is we need to start managing our land in our country in a way that doesn't make it more flammable. And so there's been a big push to integrate cultural burning and for fire agencies to learn from Indigenous owners. There's a big issue around spatial planning, and there's big debates about that. I'm going to spend most of my day today talking about this in other contexts. How do we actually think about where places are located? And we're talking here not just about individual homes, we're talking about the question of how do you relocate potentially whole settlements. There's also questions around building standards, so people are less exposed. Why do we build such flammable homes in such flammable areas? And, you know, from a vulnerabilities perspective, that's the big one. That's the human development, sustainable development question. But a particular one that's come out in this fire conversation is about how do we reduce the additional pressures on wildlife, such as why are we logging those forests when we know they're already under such pressure? Then on the kind of more resilience recovery side of things, you know, there's efforts to strengthen emergency service personnel. A lot of big equipment's being bought, you know, everyone's going crazy about AI, of course. Then try to actually create more modular infrastructure so we can shut things off so that they're not so dependent on each other. There's a lot of focus on generators. How do you actually make things more energy independent? And that intersects with conversations about greenhouse gas mitigation and the move to solar, for example. And how do we build the kind of knowledge and relationships that allow us to recover more equitably and effectively? There was a huge amount of angst and anger and reflection that came out of the fires. It actually led to a lot of political questions. One of the processes they use is called a royal commission. So this is a big cross-government kind of almost like a legal case that went into it. It took a very long time. Some people said it extended the impacts because these things are very, very stressful. But it produced a huge number of recommendations about how to improve the system in the Australian context. And all of this points towards this need for more what's called transformational adaptation. So not adaptation that just tweaks, but adaptation that actually fundamentally starts changing things. So if we are to reduce vulnerabilities properly, how do we actually, you know, reduce and reverse existing socioeconomic inequalities? How do we actually share decision making? How do we actually, you know, ensure that local governance is able to work so that people are resourced to do more local responses? And there's a whole range of different things around changing our thinking around the Australian, you know, landscape and the Australian bush, placing a lot more value on ecosystems and water catchments, doing all of these things, as well as, of course, reducing greenhouse gases to reduce the climate change as well. So that's the end. Hopefully it's given you a little bit of a insight into kind of the sort of challenges here. Yeah, it's really just a snapshot that I'm hoping will stimulate your thinking about climate change risks and adaptation in your own contexts. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was fascinating. I really loved that presentation, and it actually connects up to last week's talk very well, which was about climate impacts on the coral reef. And the way it does is that we see these bleaching events happening, and they can become more frequent. But then there's a question of like, can the coral recover? And in some places it does, but in other places, because of all these, and it's similar to the sort of compounding hazards that you talked about, there are other stresses on coral besides the temperature and the bleaching, the humans putting soil runoff, for instance, that you talked about, being that kills the corals as well. So it's sort of like, I felt last week that corals just gives us an indication of what could happen to human society, and as it becomes increasingly difficult to deal with these shocks. And your presentation reminds me of like, well, okay, it's so similar, but if there are, many fires happening quite frequently, we lose the ability to become resilient and to recover, just like the corals. But anyway, it was sort of interesting to see how those talks really connect there. And I just wonder if go on.
I was just going to say there's actually a direct link, because as I indicated, some of the fire ash and debris and soil that was washed into waterways, one of the impacts was that it goes out and did impact on the Great Barrier Reef.
Right.
So that is one of those pressures that then when the Great Barrier Reef is obviously dealing with, hotter temperatures plus acidification. So it all compounds.
Fantastic. So let's open up the questions. Yep, we already have a question here. So I'm going to ask the student to come to the front to ask the question here. And then if anybody else has a question on one of the other sides, please raise your hand so that I can. Okay, there's a question. Oh, we have a couple of questions. So let me switch camera so you can see the student who's going to ask the question from here.
Okay, great.
There we go. Okay, can you come closer?
Hello, my name is Laura.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. And I've been to Australia already several times, and I also visited some zones where there have been bushfires, and I always question myself what happens if in this zone there happens a bushfire again. Like, do the animals, for example, also the vegetation already know like how to react? Is it then more resilient to a bushfire, or is it every time like the same damage?
So it's a little bit of both. I mean, that's a really good question, and ecologists are busy trying to study this. So there's definitely adaptation that the ecosystems, the species individually are able to do. Part of that is we're seeing species ranges shift. So some species are moving to other areas. In some cases, it's not so much a shifting as a retraction. So I mentioned fire-sensitive species. The areas in which they survive are becoming smaller, but there's a feedback here where the more fire-sensitive species in a landscape tend not to reproduce, particularly the frequency of these fires. And so that's encouraging other species that tend to be able to survive and in some cases kind of thrive in these. So you're getting a shift in the ecological composition of some of these areas. That's not always, I guess, sometimes you kind of automatically evaluate that as a negative. And I'd have to say overall, I think it definitely is, because a lot of the species coming through are weed species. But at the same time, if you look over the kind of, very long history of the continent, we have had a lot of ecological shifts, big shifts over time. So it's not like we can hold things perfect and stable, which is the sort of old conservation model. And then in terms of kind of, I guess the bigger picture is that, this is a pressure on a biodiversity that is, as Brendan indicated, already under a lot of pressure. So even if kind of theoretically species are able to cope with these situations, it's the combination of things that's proving so difficult. So one of the positives out of this, or two positives to indicate, first of all, we had a change of federal government, because the way the federal government at the time dealt with this was so just disgusting that they got kicked out of office. So that's a good thing. The second thing is that it's also put a lot more focus on biodiversity. So there's now a huge amount of federal policy that's trying to actually really improve how we look after biodiversity. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that quite answered your question, but it's sort of a little bit of both.
It does. Thank you.
I hope we don't end up with just weeds and pests as a result of these disasters. Maybe I'll move between sites. We do have more questions here from Osaka, but I can see that Adam has his hand up. So Adam, would you like to ask a question, please?
Yes, thank you. Professor Rickards, my name is Adam Morrow. I'm in Professor Raj's class at the University of Hawaii. Thanks so much for your presentation. The question I have is related to disaster communications. We had a pretty horrible wildfire disaster here in Hawaii recently, and one of the issues that was raised was a lack of effective disaster communication. I appreciated in your presentation how you talked about not only fire alerts, but then also the need for smoke alerts. Would it be possible for you to share a little more detail about disaster communications in that particularly challenging fire season, as well as perhaps improvements that have been made since that, lessons learned?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a huge issue. Well, so I can. The short answer is that disaster communications was a massive problem in this situation as well. I mean, that said, of course, we always focus on the things that didn't work. But so a lot of people did get the communications and were able to leave. In the wake of the 2009 fires, there was a lot of effort to clarify and educate the public about fire communications, especially. And a lot of emphasis was placed on the need to encourage people to leave early, because the situation they found with 2009, which sadly killed over 300 people, was that people were waiting, sussing it out, which is total natural human nature, right? And then deciding to leave, so panicking, and most people were killed on the roads because they were, caught halfway between and thinking, oh, well, I know how long it takes for me to drive into town or whatever, but not realizing the roads are blocked by multiple falling trees and block cars, etc. So in a sense, the 2020 fires were considered a success because the fatalities were so much less, both in absolute terms, but also relative to the severity of the fire. And a lot of that was put down to better communications prior to the disasters. So people had better fire plans and they left. So if you're in a fire area, just leave now, like just pack, go. But at the same time, there a huge number of problems also emerged. One of them is that I showed a number of times a map of Victoria. So the top of Victoria is a river, and on the other side of it is New South Wales. And then there's New South Wales, and then there's Queensland. You also have these kind of, states approaches. And while the map sort of sitting there on the white PowerPoint slide makes it look like an island, it's not actually an island. And what we had was a lot of state-based disaster communications and maps that alerted people to things that were happening that left people completely ignorant about what was coming from the other side of the border. And so there was a lot of real problems. Probably the most acute problems of the entire fire season were on the New South Wales Victorian border in an area called East Gippsland, where people were in Victoria were shocked. Like, it didn't look too bad, but then this fire front just came across, just jumped the river like that, came across, and caused huge problems. And it actually, in that situation, was so severe that it triggered the first Navy-based rescue of people since the World War, in World War II. Because there was absolutely no other way. They were trapped because of the late warning they received, which was to do with these apps, which use maps. So that was one issue. Another issue was that they found that people for whom English wasn't a first language were hugely disadvantaged. And not just because of the actual, translating the words on the app type thing, but a huge amount of sort of cultural difference and a lack of a lot of assumed knowledge about fires, including things about sort of how long things would not work for afterwards. It's not just, fire for a couple of days and then it's passed. It's not like, so because Australia is very multicultural, but we still don't always act like it in an official way. So that was another big issue. And then I guess probably the most acute issue was that a lot of the warnings were found to be wrong. Bit of background there. Not wrong in any kind of put people in jail kind of way, but just that the monitoring we have, the models we have, just were unable to cope with the way these fires behaved. So that the fires, the meteorologists who were hugely stressed were monitoring the weather, saying the wind's going this way at this speed, this is where the fire is, we expect the fire front to move at this rate, but it didn't. It moved at triple the rate. And so that really is one of the major drivers for that inquiry. And there was a lot of angst. Unfortunately, these things become very antagonistic. But I think generally speaking, there's a sense that nobody was really found to have just been asleep at the wheel or doing a bad job, except for the Prime Minister, who was actually in Hawaii on holidays. Literally kind of lost his job for that. But it did just show that systemically, like, we just have to fix all these things at once. So yeah, I hope that gives you a bit of an indication.
It really does, and thank you so much. Appreciate your answer.
Thank you. It's interesting, Lauren, you talked about models not working. I'm not on camera, but this summer we had a typhoon where the weather forecasters weren't able to predict where it was going to move to, and it was like the models just didn't seem to apply. And maybe that will become an increasing problem in the future. Let's go to see there's University of Tsukuba, Bakitov. Would you like to ask the next question, please?
Yes. Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I was wondering, in the recent years, we see a lot of wildfires, not only in Australia, but also in the North American region. And I was wondering whether there's any specifics that differentiate the Australian wildfires from those of North America. And are there any difference in the management in terms of governmental policies, etc.?
Well, it sounds like a big research question.
We can tag team it, Lauren. You can answer the Australia part of it, and I can
Thank
answer the
you.
North American part of it. So
Thank you very much. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a little bit of a sense of just some of the the comparison with perhaps the Californian environment where we sort of done some little bit of work there. But I mean, in terms of the sort of the different approaches, I think, you know, broadly speaking, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think there's been, you know, a very strong fire suppression approach in the North American context, which we've had, but perhaps slightly less so, partly because there's also, I didn't really, I guess, indicate properly, but there's also been a kind of let it burn approach. So if it's going and it's not affecting livestock or property or something, there's a sense of just like, oh, there's a big fire over there. Certainly in the outback, that's how it is in Northern Territory. Secondly, you know, I'd be interested, I'd hear what others say, but fire is very much one of those hazards that's considered to be a kind of a government kind of question. So we have very formalized fire fighting kind of roles. So even if most of those roles are unpaid, those unpaid forces, so they call them country fire agencies, are very formalized in a really kind of structured governance context. And there's a lot of standards, and, you know, to become a volunteer firefighter, you've got to go through all these steps and, you know, checks and balances. And so it's all sort of very sort of pseudo-professionalized, if you like. So yeah, which is kind of contrary to them not being paid. But anyway, that's the sort of culture we have. But I'll stop there. How does that relate to the Hawaii and North American context?
I think it's similar in that in both parts of the world, fire suppression, cultural burning was sort of poo-pooed all over and sort of like banned when Bureau of Land Management and these more formal institutions took over, just because they didn't have a way of validating indigenous epistemologies. Or like you said, you know, fire was something to be afraid of, and so they burnt it out. But in all of our cultures from all over the world, fire is celebrated. It's part of the law. You know, Diwali's coming up in 2 weeks. And fire, flame, light is, you know, centered to that. So many stories around the world, right? But like that didn't translate into the formalization of these institutions that took over the formal management of large landscapes. So, you know, 200 years fast forward, we banned cultural practice of burning and controlled burns. But now Bureau of Land Management is we're going back into like, maybe there's value in indigenous knowledge, maybe there's value in those epistemologies. They've realized it works, and now they're bringing it back. They're working with different tribes, you know, in California and other places to see how it can actually play a role in mitigating and reducing risk of wildfires. So that's one thing that has happened here. And I'm not sure like how much of, you know, sort of like bringing it back, working with indigenous groups is happening in Australia. I'm like vague about that. So I don't know about that, but I do know that there was a stronger policy shift in Australia where there was more formal language around how to handle wildfire from a federal level. In the US, because of the way government is set up, we're a federalist government, so a lot of power actually lies with states. And then, you know, in terms of local governments and response, and depending on what state you're on, local governments actually have a lot of power. So the federal mandate is that each local government, each state needs to have its own hazard mitigation plan. And so the conceptual ways in which to actually mitigate wildfires should be integrated into those plans. How they're implemented, enforced, rolled out differs a lot. The other place like where there's distinctions is that spatial planning in the US perhaps has a longer history, and there's a lot more land use planning that happens here. Everything is zoned, everything is controlled. And so there's a lot more tools and mechanisms that actually exist and that are already out there. The problem is politics. We know where we shouldn't be building, but we're still building there, you know, we're still building in the WUI when we know we shouldn't be. So it's actually a political problem then it
Mhm.
is a problem of like, do we have the tools? Do we have the knowledge? Insofar as that. So yeah, that's my sense of like similarities and differences.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you both for the answers.
Thank you for the question. We have another question a couple of questions from Osaka University. Boyd, I think you were first, and then this one. Go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture. I just wanted to ask the question because in the previous lecture, we had a survey in our class about asking the students of other universities on their opinion of how the trust in the governments to apply or comply to the climate change regulations and disaster responses is for us in our opinion, and then compared to the worldwide. So after hearing the disastrous response from the previous Prime Minister, I just wanted to ask, has there been a shift nowadays? So in the last four past years in the public of Australia, referring to the trust in the government, or is like the mistrust just like rapidly decreasing because of previous experiences?
Well, that's a very fraught question. What I would say, and obviously, you know, I'm speaking as someone from a particular political leaning myself, is that the change in government was triggered by a wave of a calling out for a more trustworthy government, a government that we could rely on. And I have to say that, you know, generally speaking, I still think that change has been, definitely positive, and people are engaging again much more with politics, much more with these processes. And just as an aside, in the sort of climate change response kind of space more generally, I think there's been a kind of coming back to the state, the government, as having a really, really central role. I think for a while it was considered to be each community for themselves, each business for themselves, but there's a real sense of kind of we need big institutions to be leading us here, which is why, as I said at the start, we now are doing a national climate risk assessment. We're doing a national climate change adaptation plan, whereas previously it's like, well, we're not going to impose, you guys do what you want kind of sense. What I would also say, though, is that mistrust in government and mistrust in authorities more broadly is a persistent and potentially even kind of intensifying problem. And that's for a whole lot of reasons, not just obviously to do with disasters, but if you imagine, across the realm of groups of people that have still not been able to get through the sort of bureaucracy in order to rebuild a home after 2 years, your faith in institutions is just shot to pieces. So, I think people feel really abandoned. I think there's a sense that the social contract, and this has been worsened by subsequent disasters. So in the Northern Rivers, for the 2022 floods in the Northern Rivers area, which came in at 17 something meters, so like meters above what the predictions were, devastated whole cities. City of Lismore. You've got there, a really broken kind of community, and others are watching on. That has really broken that social contract. So the government has a lot of work to do to earn back trust. I think they're aware of that, and they're certainly aware of it with a kind of election coming up next year. And all of this, of course, flows into the rise of the far right, and a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of kind of prepping, and then flows right back to kind of very immediate practical questions about disaster response. And so one of the challenges they found in more recent disasters is people don't trust the warnings. They don't respond to the warnings. They create their own kind of warnings. So there's a kind of fraying of that that disaster response because of this bigger picture. So you're absolutely right to call it out.
Just maybe to add on to that, because I find it really interesting as well and I think one of the other professors mentioned it as well. It's more of a political question nowadays, because due to those catastrophes, at least in my experiences, how I saw in the news and stuff, it's more than nowadays the questions before elections of right-wing parties, nationalists, like trying to use those disasters to strengthen their own agenda instead of then the real focus of how can we fix those problems. And then it's still like a battle between parties instead of actually going against the problem. So it was interesting to see that's like in Australia as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's definitely the case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, one more question from here, and then we'll go to the Scuba University students who are kindly waiting online.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very good. My name's Rory. I was curious about taking advantage of the affected areas of the wildfires. In Anna Singh's The Mushroom at the End of the World, she speaks about matsutake mushrooms living in blasted environments within Japan around Hiroshima, and says that the matsutake is able to guide us to possibilities with coexistence within environmental disturbance. I was wondering if there was any attempts to kind of take advantage of this landscape, whether it be increased nitrogen in the soil or just big now unused landscapes to try and take advantage of this awful situation that's happened, try and find positives in it.
Yeah. Absolutely, and always happy to have Anna Singh quoted in a class. It's great. Yeah, and there was a real sense that this was the end of the world, and it triggered a lot of, I think, it kind of really accelerated a lot of quite radical thinking. And before I get to the kind of land management question, like just as an example of that, the fires, plus, I didn't even mention, but this is, in the context of COVID and stuff as well, triggered in my local city of Melbourne something called Regen Melbourne, and there's a whole lot of regen city things around the world, and it's about using donut economics, which sadly is nothing about donuts, but it's all about really actually acting on the Sustainable Development Goals and actually taking planetary boundaries seriously and saying, what do we actually need to change? And that now has 250 organisations involved, and it's about how do we reshape Melbourne to actually get on the trajectory we need to be. There was that real sense we are really on the wrong trajectory, and this isn't just about individual little issues, this is about big picture stuff. And so there's been some really productive, stimulating conversations, and as a kind of pilot project, we're trying to make the Yarra River, the Birrarung River, Indigenous language, swimmable, which to my German friends around me here in Freiburg is kind of hilarious because all their rivers are beautifully swimmable and people swim all the time. But in the middle of Melbourne, the idea of swimming in the Birrarung is very uninviting. So that's just a kind of, to fix that problem requires just so many different aspects of things to improve. On the land management thing, you're right. There has been efforts to, I think what it's done is it's stimulated interest in landscape scale conservation. So we have a kind of big influx now of big philanthropic groups that are often underpinned by, high wealth individuals to really start buying up massive tracts of land to try to restore them. It's really emphasised the need to build up the ecological integrity of landscapes so that they're less susceptible to fire. I think you could arguably say that it very much pushed the Victorian government to ban native forest logging. So it's being wound up as an industry by 2030, which is, of course, still far, far too slow, but that has brought its decline and its end forward by, I think it's like 3 to 5 years. So yeah, there's all these sorts of efforts to do things. And the other thing that I would suggest you could link it to is a resurgence in interest around regenerative agriculture. So yeah, so they're not specific kind of, I guess, place-based examples for you, but I do agree that there's been efforts to kind of think differently now.
Thank you very much.
Great. I hope the students will look into regenerative agriculture and regenerative economics, because I really,
Syntropic farming.
yeah, it's a really important direction going forward from here. And thank you for bringing that up. Reynard, sorry to keep you waiting.
Sorry, sir. I just wanted to ask, I guess, like after seeing the impact section of the wildfires, it was more like towards the feasible concepts, like the displacement of communities. But I'd like to ask, how can we, I guess, in your opinion, measure something that's less tangible, like the mental health aspect of the affected communities? Like, is there a sort of mechanism, maybe in Australia, that on separating the mental impacts of these disasters and also essentially their predisposed conditions I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Look, there's been a lot of public health research into this, and generally speaking, it uses large-scale quantitative survey instruments to try to do these things. It's very, very difficult to do well, as you would expect. So yeah, there is, I would say there's evidence behind the mental health impacts of these events, but the complexity soon, starts to overwhelm you in terms of kind of like attributing things directly. What I would say is that there's a lot of concern that mental illness in that sort of at the more acute end is increasing. And that, of course, that then is a predisposing factor to being particularly badly impacted by events like the fires. So there's definitely concern about the long-term trajectory. And I would say, quite an encouraging degree of kind of resourcing and effort that's going in to mental health awareness and public health interventions to try to improve that.
I see. All right then. Yeah, I guess like it's a bit difficult, especially when there are people that are suffering from like predisposed illnesses. So that is probably a challenge for the future. But yeah, thank you for your answer.
Yeah, and just one little specific thing I didn't mention was that in that disaster response period, one of the things that came out of the Royal Commission report was how insensitive a lot of the evacuation and sort of safety hubs were to people with particular needs. So basically everyone would be thrown together into like a sports stadium and told to kind of live there on top of each other for weeks at a time, which was acutely stressful for a lot of people and led to some really quite violent kind of situations and stuff. So yeah. And
great. Okay, I think Asako, you have a question.
Hey, hi, thank you for your lecture. And it might be a bit of a personal question, but when the fire happened a few years ago, I was actually living in New Zealand, and I remember the sky turned ashy yellow. And I was wondering if any extreme cases or increased frequency of wildfire happen in Australia in the future, like would it impact New Zealand a lot more, or like in what sort of ways would it impact New Zealand?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So I think the answer is yes, because the way the winds move and stuff, we know we've already seen that the Australian fires will travel by smoke across. But also I know from working on the IPCC chapter that included New Zealand, one of the climate change projections and already evident impacts in New Zealand is that a fairly unflammable country is becoming more flammable. And there were those fires a couple of years ago in the hills behind one of the cities that the kind of, I guess, evaluation of it was that the response was very much hampered by the degree of surprise that fire was occurring in New Zealand, and a degree of unpreparedness for that. So I think fire is now on the agenda in the New Zealand context, and unfortunately will become more so, as it is around the world. I mean, one of the things when you have a planet that's becoming hotter, you know, and also with more volatile weather, I think more fire is inevitable.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, and now I can see Chewy. That's that.
Sorry. I just want to ask, is there any future predictions of the wildfires in Australia? Like, will the situation get intensified? And like, how is the communities going to mitigate it? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. I should have outlined the projections. In a sense, they're unsurprising. So on all dimensions, the fires are predicted to worsen, so more frequent, larger scale, and more intensive. And so it's a massive question about how can we create a society that can manage that. It means that the idea of, you know, even prepare early, which was the response from a decade ago, that was the kind of big shift, prepare early and go. Even that's going to be inadequate. There's going to be some places where, you know, if you prepare early and go, you're not going to be back in your house for months. So basically, we need to actually not just stop new development in high fire risk areas. We actually need to get communities out, and that's a hugely difficult conversation about choices, about costs, about where people go. Because, you know, at the same time, we're also retreating from the coastline because of sea level rise and flooding. So, you know, we're starting to get pretty squished, little strip around the coast. So, yeah, the point is that it is worsening. And so I think that's why there's been such intense focus on those 2025s, because people see it as a window onto the future.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we have a few minutes left, Laura. So there's a maybe a couple of questions from WhatsApp University, if that's okay.
Hi, my name is Miki, and I'm interested in climate migration. I'm from the American Midwest, and like we're expecting to see more people migrating to cities in the Midwest in coming years because of the wildfires in the West and like hurricanes in the Southeast, for example. And also here in Japan, like recently with the disaster in Ishikawa, a lot of young people are leaving. So I'm wondering if in Australia you just touched on this briefly just now, but if there are areas that are less vulnerable to wildfires, and if like what kinds of strains maybe on resources or social tensions are being caused by internal migration.
Yeah, thank you. You're right. I think internal migration is one of those large-scale climate change impacts that hasn't really got a lot of attention. There's obviously been quite a lot of focus on international migration, but yeah, I mean, the short answer is that Australia is looking at a major geographical rearrangement, in my opinion. And some of that will be managed. So that will be where there's kind of coordinated efforts to relocate. And some of it is more that kind of, you know, autonomous type decisions of individuals, households, businesses starting to relocate as well. And of course, you know, you then get the feedback loops. And what we're finding in Australia is, I'm sure, similar to what you've got in the Midwest, where you've got a feedback loop between a declining population that's also particularly declining very rapidly with young people and particularly young women. So you've got a kind of aging, declining population, and declines in the services available, because, you know, more and more, you know, there's rationalisation of where the services are delivered to. You know, health service, for example, there's a big problem in Australia about getting doctors, dentists, as well as all sorts of other professionals, lawyers. I was just reading about yesterday, getting them into it's called the bush. So that's part of it. But all of that is to say that's just me describing a trajectory, and it's not predetermined. And one of the options we have is to actually think as a society, where do we want people to live? Can we actually create a more decentralized, less capital city focused way of doing things, and invest, including in hazard reduction measures, in different parts? So I would say that if we do nothing, then we're going to get faster urbanization, and that is creating enormous acute pressures in those urban areas. Housing prices and rental prices are extreme. But I also think, similar to one of the earlier questions, there is an appetite now of people starting to say, we can't just keep doing this. This is not sustainable. We actually need to change. And there's kind of growing efforts to kind of regionalize Australia. So we'll see.
Thanks. I think we're probably close to the end now. I see it's actually 29 minutes past, and I really appreciate the fact that you gave a really wonderful talk, and then also very thoughtful answers to everybody's questions, which is impressive because it's 6 o'clock. It was 6 o'clock in the morning when you started. It's 7:30. So thank you so much, Laura, for a really excellent lecture. And I'm going to take away from this class the notion of transformational adaptation. I think that's super important, and we need to understand it, and we need to do more work in this area. So maybe we can show our appreciation to Laura. Or what that would be so
No, it's been a pleasure. And I just think that having more people kind of reflecting on these things, as everyone in this room is doing, is just a vital thing for the world. So great work, everyone.
Great. Thank you. I hope you have a nice cup of coffee or breakfast or whatever you're doing.
I'm going to go hunt one down now.
Okay. Great. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.
See everybody next week for Subhashini's lecture on food security and climate change. Looking forward.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thanks.